Hi, folks out there. I hope you can hear me.
Hi, folks out there. I hope you can hear me. Hi, folks out there. I hope you can hear me. Hi, folks out there.
Well, seem to have some weird echoes on this, don't we? I'm just testing this out at the moment. If you're watching this at the moment, it looks a bit weird. Oh, that's better. I got rid of that. I'm trying to get this lighting right. And we'll be good to go, hopefully. Okay, well, that's just going to have to be good enough, isn't it? Oh, it's nearly 7 o'clock, and I'm going to start this. This is my first ever live stream, so do bear with me if I screw up. And we're going to see how it goes in a minute. There's a couple of minutes before we actually start, so this, of course, is a bit I'm going to edit out later on. Okay, so starting kind of 2 minutes. So for the next 2 minutes, you can do whatever you like. Twiddle your thumbs or anything at all. So yeah, I'm just making sure I'm all set up for this. Looks like the microphone's working. It looks like the video's working. So I think we should be pretty much ready to go. So another 2 minutes, and then I'm going to start talking. So the next 2 minutes, I might just sit here and stare at the screen and wait for it all to happen. And then it'll all be happening, won't it? Turn that around a bit. How's that? That's better. Okay, my head there in front of the light. So this will officially be starting. You may be watching this already, but it's not officially starting for 1 more minute. And in 1 more minute, it's going to officially start. Definitely edit this bit out later on. Okay. Okay, hello everybody, it's 7 o'clock and my name's Chris Gregory and this is my first live stream, so do excuse me if I screw up at some point. I hope you're going to enjoy this. Now, Andy Warhol, back in the 1960s, he once said that in the future everybody's going to be on television, and that's kind of come true, isn't it? Even I'm on television, I think. So hello to everybody out there, anywhere where you might be, somewhere across the world. So I'm the author of this book here, Minstrel Boy, which Minstrel Boy, let's get that right, yes, there it goes, the Metamorphoses of Bob Dylan, and also Determined to Stand, the Reinvention of Bob Dylan. And these are 2 books which are part of the trilogy Picasso of Song. Picasso of Song is a quote from the other great lyrical song poet Leonard Cohen, and it's very, very appropriate description of Bob Dylan. Like Picasso, Bob Dylan's had a very, very long career. He's really been the most influential figure, just as Picasso was the most influential figure in the history of modern art. Bob Dylan has certainly arguably been the most influential figure in modern rock music. He's been through a lot of different phases and stages and has taken a lot of other people with him. He's also inspired lots of other song poets like Leonard Cohen, Joni Mitchell, and so on, who've been successful afterwards. So, I want to talk first really about poetry. Now, there was a so-called controversy a few years ago when Bob Dylan was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature. This was unprecedented that a singer, particularly a rock singer, possibly a pop star, could be awarded such an award. And there was a lot of people putting in their two penny worth and going online and going in the newspapers and actually making, quite a fuss about this. Some people were saying, well, the most common phrase was this one: Bob Dylan's poetry, it doesn't work on the page. Well, folks, something is happening here and you don't know what it is, because it's not really meant to work on the page, is it? It's meant to work in live performance and on records. It's meant to work as you listen to it. This is not the kind of poetry that you hear on Radio 2 on a Sunday afternoon, a kind of cozy chat. It's not the kind of poetry you see in a lot of Facebook groups. It's not like John Betjeman or Pam Ayres or any of these kind of people. Bob Dylan's poetry is from a tradition of visionary poetry. You might call it real poetry. Poetry that comes from the heart, poetry that comes from the soul, if you like, which expresses really deep inner feelings and and what is there, as I say, in your soul. Bob Dylan has relatively few influences from 20th century poetry. His influences tend to be stretching really all the way back to classical antiquity, and you can particularly talk about Shakespeare. You can talk about the Romantic poets. You can talk about the French symbolists, Walt Whitman, and the Beat poets. There's a whole tradition of kind of visionary poetry. So that's really what Bob Dylan actually draws on for his work. Now, this is kind of in opposition to what the academics, those people that jumped up and said, Bob Dylan, his work doesn't work on the page. It's in opposition to their kind of ideology of what poetry is. A lot of modern poetry is just kind of very stripped down, pure images and so on. You have to make it as short as possible. This doesn't appeal to many people. This is not popular. The leading modern poets, so-called, they produce these tiny little slim volumes, which nobody buys, and you never see them in the shops and so on. On the other hand, Bob Dylan is a different kettle of fish. Bob Dylan has, of course, sold millions of records, as a lot of these other song poets have. So he produces what I call song poetry. Now, this is nothing new, of course. It's perceived as being something new, but of course it isn't. In fact, it's the beginning of all Western literature, going right back to Homer's Odyssey and the Iliad, which in those days would have been performed. It wouldn't just been somebody sitting there in some university reading something. This would have been performed, and it would have been performed dramatically. It would have been performed with music, and that's absolutely sure. And that's really what literature was for thousands of years, because most people in the ancient world and Middle Ages couldn't even read. So that's how it had to be performed. So Bob Dylan draws on that tradition, but also so do a lot of poets that are established in the literary tradition, such as William Blake, whose most famous books of poetry are called Songs of Innocence and Experience. I guess Wordsworth and Robert Burns, and these kind of people. Robert Burns actually wrote his poems based on traditional folk tunes, which is exactly what Bob Dylan actually does. So Bob Dylan has liberated poetry. If you talk to Bob Dylan fans, like you really hardcore Bob Dylan fans, there might be a few of you out there, then you can have a conversation consisting entirely of bits of Bob Dylan songs about each other, to each other. So, you can see a mass audience of people, hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people watching Bob Dylan shows. And a lot of those people already know all the words by heart. Of course, when Bob Dylan performs these poetry live, the song poetry, then he always changes it, doesn't he? If you go and see a Bob Dylan concert now and expect it to be anything like you've heard on his records, you're going to be sorely disappointed. What he's actually doing now is sitting behind a piano and hiding. He's certainly not standing there with an acoustic guitar and a harmonica rack playing Blowing in the Wind. You'll be very lucky to hear Blowing in the Wind, I guess. And if you do, or Mr. Tambourine Man, or Like a Rolling Stone, if you do, it won't sound anything like the original. So whereas a lot of 60s acts are out there still playing, you can see the Rolling Stones, for instance, and nearly all of their act will be exactly the same as it was in 1973, played in exactly the same way. So a lot of people of his generation are just kind of nostalgia acts in lots of ways. But Dylan's live performances are always very challenging. So what he does with his song poetry, he continually changes it. He continually makes it kind of multi-dimensional. So I would argue that this kind of poetry is far more appealing to people and far more powerful than the vast majority of modern poetry, the kind of stuff that the academics like. So this is the first point I want to make, really. Bob Dylan is in that tradition, and that tradition is often linked to radical political statements, as in the work of Percy Bysshe Shelley. But Bob Dylan is also influenced by a lot of other things. Bob Dylan is also influenced, as is well known, by different forms of music, because he's a kind of musical polymath. And through his career, he's explored a lot of different types of music, beginning with kind of folk music and the blues, and then we have country music and gospel music. He's really moved through lots and lots of different kind of phases. Now, you know, some of his great heroes are people like Hank Williams, the country singer, Robert Johnson, the blues singer, and he really, I think, regards that kind of stuff as poetry. A lot of blues songs have got their own original take on this kind of poetry. It tends to be, this kind of stuff doesn't tend to be accepted by academics, but they're big influences on Bob Dylan's work. So when I'm writing the books, which consist of these are big books, and they're all 200,000, 3 books of 200,000 words each, and I'm looking at all of Bob Dylan's songs in detail. These books are studies of Bob Dylan as a songwriter and also as a performer. So different styles. Bob Dylan has moved through lots of different styles in his career. Another very important influence on Bob Dylan is drama. And people say, how can you listen to this guy singing with this horrible voice? He sounds like that. And actually, perhaps one way in to listen to Bob Dylan, if you're not attuned to it, is to think of him more as an actor. Think of him like, say, a great actor performing soliloquies from Shakespeare. You can't have Bob Dylan on the background in nice middle-class dinner parties, can you? It's not background music. It's something you have to listen to. And the fact that his voice is difficult to listen to by some standards makes it easier for you to actually pick up on what he's saying. It puts the emphasis. It will not blend into the background. Having said that, Bob Dylan's actual performing style changes tremendously throughout his entire career, and his voice is probably different on every single album. So if you explore that, you'll probably discover that. So Dylan even was very influenced by Bertolt Brecht, the famous German playwright, who writing in the 1940s and 50s, who used songs as part of his dramatic performances. That's also something that Shakespeare did as well. And it's perhaps no surprise that Bob Dylan songs have actually been adapted into the musical Girl from the North Country, which has been running all over the world for about 10 years. And has actually been very successful because the songs are very dramatic, and they can also be changed into lots of different styles. So this is how Bob Dylan has brought poetry to the masses. This is how Bob Dylan's work has made poetry multi-dimensional. So that's really, in a way, the main inspiration of my books. Now, I thought there was a need, really. I mean, I've been a Bob Dylan fan since I was very small, and I've been following his work through most of his career. And I've read during that time, being a big fan, I like a lot of fans out there, I've read a tremendous number of books about Bob Dylan. And I've always been slightly dissatisfied with all of them. I'm certainly admire the work of Michael Gray, particularly his first version of the book, and Paul Williams, his wonderful trilogy. They come from different angles. Michael Gray's very analytical. Paul Williams is very enthusiastic. I was a bit disappointed in some of the work of Grail Marcus because it tends to trail off into something which isn't really analysis of Bob Dylan songs. So I thought there was a really important need to actually do a really comprehensive series of books, and got to be a lot of them because Bob Dylan's career is now so huge, in order to do a proper, respectful study of all Bob Dylan songs. So that's what I'm trying to do in the Picasso of Song trilogy. So the books really consist of quite detailed analyses of the texts, but it's very important to me that I'm not just writing for an academic audience. I'm trying to write for people that like Bob Dylan. So you can read these books, read a little bit of the book, listen to the song, read a bit more, listen to the song. That's the way to kind of consume these books, if you like. So there are detailed analyses of the text in the books, and I'll be in a few minutes I'll be reading an example of this. But one thing that's really important to remember about Bob Dylan: he's very funny. He's very, very funny, and even like some of his most famous songs, like say "Subterranean Homesick Blues," you don't need a weatherman to know which way the wind blows. These lines are really extremely funny, and that's what a lot of people actually forget. I remember listening to a very early recording of Bob Dylan when he was performing some of his songs for the first time, songs like Desolation Row. People were laughing all the way through, and that seems very strange. I've seen analyses of some Bob Dylan songs, such as the Ballad of Frankie Lee and Judas Priest, which is a long comical ballad. Some people think it's a serious religious text, but really it's Bob Dylan taking the mickey out of people for the way they analyze his songs. Now, because Bob Dylan is so popular and anybody can write about it, particularly on the internet now, the internet is full of very, very kind of trivial analyses. So I thought it was very, very important to actually do something which drew all these things together. The influence of different types of music, the influence of different types of poetry, and, as I say, drama, and put them all together. And the other thing, I guess, is actually art. And Picasso is actually quite a big influence on Bob Dylan. He actually is a painter himself, really. Here's Picasso. Here he is, yeah. And I'll talk about that in a minute. In his song Tangled Up in Blue, Dylan is one of the things I talk about in the book. He's mentioned this in interviews, but nobody's really done a proper analysis of it. He's actually influenced by Picasso because he writes a song in a way that in which the structures of time and chronological time, they all break down, and he keeps switching his pronouns. So it's almost like you're listening to the story of the song and you're seeing it from lots and lots of different angles at the same time, which is what you get in that kind of Picasso painting. So Bob Dylan's art is kind of modern art, it's kind of postmodernist, and it's influenced by all those things. So I wanted, in my analyses, to draw all of those things together. So the Picasso of Song trilogy began with Determined to Stand, the first book, which looks quite small, but it's actually just got small print, so it's just 200,000 words. This was a book about Bob Dylan's later work from 1997, Time Out of Mine onwards, to kind of now Rough and Rowdy Ways, the present day, and it was looking at all those songs. I didn't do that chronologically because I thought those albums that he's been making since then, in the latter part of his career, which is perceived as one of his great comebacks, I guess, they do have a particular style. They tend to be very postmodern in that they take bits from other songs and other sources and throw them all together. And people accuse him of stealing things, and he does. He steals things and puts them together. But that's exactly what blues singers do in their songs. Even the great Robert Johnson with the recordings he made, half of the words in those songs had been taken from other songs. So that's also part of the tradition that Bob Dylan is actually part of. So so I've tried to put all that stuff together. The second book, I started after I'd done the first book. I started putting out blogs and podcasts, and naturally I started writing about other Bob Dylan songs, earlier Bob Dylan songs. So then the next book I've put out is Bob Dylan's middle period. So Minstrel Boy covers Dylan's work from 1967, when he fell off his motorbike and retreated into the countryside, up till 1990. It's quite a long span of time, but this is the period of Bob Dylan's work where he changes the most. This is the period where he goes through a lot of different styles. He's got his country period, I suppose you might say. He's got his gospel period and so on. And he really goes through a lot of different changes. This might be called really Dylan's years of struggle, in which he's one of the first generation as well of rock stars from the 60s who's coping with becoming middle-aged at this point, which to a lot of people in the 80s, they were really struggling, as Bob Dylan was in some ways. The first part of Minstrel Boy, this is a book that I decided to do in more chronological order this time because of these existence of these different phases. The first part of Minstrel Boy is looking at his work from 1967 onwards. I've gone into a lot of detail about the basement tapes, which I don't think anybody's really done before, and I'll actually be reading you an extract of that in a few minutes. And then I'm talking about John Wesley Harding, and then albums like Nashville Skyline and Self-Portrait and New Morning, in which he does much more subtly kind of simple songs. And these songs express the fact that he's walked away from the mainstream. He's living out in the countryside, raising his family, very, very different to the kind of mad, surreal poetry of his mid-60s output or the political stuff of his early 60s output. So the second part of the book, that part is called Retreat, which is what he was doing. The second part of the book is called Return. Now, from 1974 to 1978, Bob Dylan was doing lots of tours, making a film. He became the kind of headliner at very large rock music events, possibly arguably the biggest rock star in the world at that point. When he toured in 1974, there was several million people trying to get tickets. A lot of them obviously didn't get it, didn't get those tickets. So, this is the period during which Bob Dylan produced this amazing trilogy of albums: Blood on the Tracks, Desire, and Straight Legal. And I do very detailed analyses of all the songs from those albums. Now, from 1970, late 1978, 1979 onwards, Bob Dylan experienced a religious conversion, which for the first year or so of it, he really got into fundamentalist Christianity. He abandoned all his old songs. He wouldn't play any of them on stage. He went on stage and he was even doing long sermons, preaching on stage about the coming of Armageddon and the end of the world and all that kind of thing. And this was a huge confrontation with his fans, very much probably on a level with what happened in 1965, 66 when he went electric. This was something which is more difficult to write about, because a lot of the songs of the first Christian period are really quite simple. Arguably the ones that work best are actually the simplest ones. And he was almost getting into some kind of reactionary politics and so on. After a year or two, he started to move away from that. He started to do his old songs in concerts. And then he started to write some very interesting songs that were actually explaining how he moved away from that fundamentalist position into what I'd call a kind of Blakean Christianity, to a much wider view of religion, which is really dominated the rest of the time. During the 1980s, he was struggling in lots of ways. He was producing nearly an album every year, and towards the end of the decade, he was struggling to fill those albums with his own songs. Apparently, he even thought about giving up. And at the end of the 80s, he brings out the album Oh Mercy, which is another one of his famous comebacks. So I'm looking at all the songs from these albums in this book, and in great detail. But I'm also looking at live performance. As I was saying earlier, what Bob Dylan does with his song poetry when he's performing live is actually continually reinventing the songs. Some of these songs, he's been touring continuously since 1988, and some of these songs have been thousands of times, have been through lots and lots of different versions. You never quite know what you're going to get when you see Bob Dylan. This keeps the poetry alive. This is why this poetry is so multi-dimensional. So I've actually talked quite a lot about that in the book, and the analysis of the songs are kind of broken up by accounts of live shows, TV appearances, live performances, because I think that's a very, very important part of Bob Dylan's art. It gives you a little bit of break from the in-depth analysis of the poetry and how the music enhances the poetry. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to read you a fairly short extract. It's only maybe 10 minutes at the most. And this is to do with the song The Mighty Quinn, which a lot of people don't even know Bob Dylan wrote. It was a song from the Basement Tapes from 1967. And this became a big hit, actually, when it was recorded by other artists. So the first part of the reading is the bit about the television performance by Manfred Mann, and the second part is about the song itself. Okay, February the 15th, 1968. There's a bit of autobiographical stuff here, I have to confess. So again, February the 15th, 1968. All across the British Isles, families are gathered around their little black and white TVs. They've had their tea now, that's what we say in England, in the evening, and are settling down to their evening's entertainment. The teens are excited. They're ready to have the usual arguments with their parents over Top of the Pops, with Mum complaining that the young men who are singing look like girls, while Dad, in the midst of reloading his pipe with St. Bruno, grumbles about the lack of proper music on the show. He perks up a little, though, when the scantily clad Dolly Bird dancers come on, even if their choreography leaves a little to be desired. The climax of the show occurs, as usual, with the announcement of the number one. As a catchy flute intro starts off a now familiar tune, we see the eager studio audience begin to dance, or perhaps shuffle would be a better description, to a happy, poppy tune with the highly singable chorus, "Come all without, come all within, you'll not see nothing like the mighty Quinn." What does that mean? We'll look at that in a minute. Soon we get a few shots of Manfred Mann, a successful British pop group with a string of hits under their belt, swaying along and pretending to play their instruments. The lead singer, an undoubtedly pretty young man called Mike Darbo, gesticulates as he leads the group through the first verse, and it runs, "Everybody's building ships and boats. Some are building monuments. Some are jotting down notes." Well, that kind of makes some sense, doesn't it? When he reaches the second verse, he's miming, of course, as he mimes to "jumping queues and making haste and eat my cup of meat." He gives a slight grimace to the camera. You can tell that he's mouthing these words without an inkling of what they actually mean. The most famous of the nonsense songs on the Basement Tapes is The Mighty Quinn, otherwise known as Quinn the Eskimo. Manfred Mann had great success in the UK with their extremely bright, optimistic and poppy version of the song. The chorus, "Come all without, come all within, you'll not see nothing but the mighty Quinn," even became a popular chant on English football grounds for several years. It's the only Bob Dylan song that football crowds have ever sung. The alliterative second half of the chorus is another one of Dylan's double negatives, like if you ain't got nothing, you got nothing to lose. He likes that kind of stuff. It's very ambiguous. While the first part appears to be an almost religious kind of rallying cry. Quinn the Eskimo's anticipated arrival will be treated with great reverence, however. The title of the song has been identified as a reference to the 1960 film The Savage Innocents, which featured the Mexican-American actor Anthony Quinn playing the part of Inuk, an Eskimo or an Inuit, if you want to use the correct modern term, I guess. Although the character in the song has nothing in common with the part Quinn plays in the movie. The song has been covered by many different artists, including the Grateful Dead, although Dylan has only performed it on a handful of occasions. In both of the takes on the Basement tapes, Dylan adopts a deep, gravelly vocal tone far removed from the hit single's bouncy surface. Although The Mighty Quinn is in many ways another light-hearted children's song, the way it's performed here makes it sound more than a little spooky. This emphasises the comic irony of the piece, as Dylan's rather nervous-sounding narrator delivers another song full of highly ambiguous nonsense lyrics, set against a potentially sing-along chorus, which he deliberately plays down. He sounds distinctly worried about the imminent arrival of the much-revered Eskimo, despite the man's apparent status as some kind of saviour. In the first of the song's 3 verses, the apparently joyful, optimistic lyrics come over as dryly ironic. Everybody's building, I'm trying to imitate this, it's really bad, but everybody's building the big ships and boats. Some are building monuments, others are jotting down notes. It's even more scary than that, really. Dylan sings slyly from the side of his mouth as he describes the general excitement at the imminent arrival of another messiah-like figure. There's an intimation that the involvement of children in the narrative. Everybody's in despair, every girl and boy, with Quinn being presented here almost as a Santa Claus figure. But when the Eskimo gets here, everybody's going to jump for joy. But Dylan's deadpan delivery makes these lines sound darkly ominous, an effect which is increased by Garth Hudson's churchy organ. The narrator growls, "I like to do just like the rest. I like my sugar sweet." The delicious ambiguity of the second line, you can read that in a lot of ways, can be read as a coded reference to sex and drugs, sex or drugs. The next line features some of Dylan's most memorable absurdist images. But guarding fumes and making haste, it ain't my cup of meat. Cup of meat? Here, as in elsewhere on the Basement tapes, he creates a comic effect by substituting an unexpected word for the obvious one. Instead of cup of tea, the famous English phrase, cup of meat. So, the rhyming of sweet and meat is particularly effective, suggesting that whatever the supposedly beneficent Quinn will bring will be more substantial, and perhaps more indigestible than followers might expect. The narrator then observes a little caustically that everybody's 'neath the trees, feeding pigeons on a limb, but when Quinn the Eskimo gets here, all the pigeons gonna run to him, suggesting that Quinn's followers are nothing more than dumb birds who are only interested in whoever is providing the most crumbs. As the song reaches its climax, Dylan ramps up the nonsense factor. The opening lines of the Basement tapes performances are virtually unintelligible, but when the song is first performed in a cheerfully rocked out version at the Isle of Wight Festival in 1969, we get this: a cat's meow and a cow's moo, I can recite 'em all, followed by just tell me where it hurts you, honey, I'll tell you who to call. This appears to be some kind of reference to the general malaise that the boys and girls are suffering from before the mighty Quinn comes to save them. And then, in a wonderful final comic twist, Dylan tells us that nobody can get any sleep. There's someone on everybody's toes. A rather surreal or perhaps merely silly image, which is followed by the knowingly ironic, but when Quinn the Eskimo gets here, everybody's going to want to doze. Our saviour will, it seems, be bringing the gift of repose to the citizens. In I'm Only Sleeping, from the Beatles' Revolver, released in the previous year, John Lennon had presented sleeping as a metaphor for stoned intoxication. Here the doze, double meaning is rather more obviously indicated. Remember, this is Bob Dylan going to his country retreat. He's obviously been caning it with a lot of substances, and he's now kind of drying out in the country, being a country guy, cuts his hair, grows a beard, becomes a regular kind of character, or he tries to, for for a while. So very much the background of this, I think, as it is with a lot of the basement tapes, in a kind of weird coded way. So is the mighty Quinn a drug dealer? Is this song a coded warning about the effects of various substances? As usual, Dylan delights in such ambiguity. Quinn's arrival is certainly highly anticipated, but the hollowness of his status as a saviour is challenged here. The pigeons, we are left in no doubt, will all follow him. Perhaps, however, they will merely do their business on him. That's an English phrase. I don't know if anybody else in the world understands that one, but you can work it out. They'll do their business on him as if he's a statue. The song can be seen as mocking the way in which some religious people follow their leaders blindly, especially as the chorus is modelled on the kind of spirituals that gospel choirs regularly perform. So it's almost like a religious celebration, but at the same time, Dylan very much has his tongue firmly in his cheek. As with so many of the basement songs, it might be read as an ironic reference to Dylan's own career, given that his more excitable acid-head followers had acclaimed him as some kind of messiah. The mighty Quinn can also be seen as a parody of how the modern media creates false prophets. When Quinn finally arrives, all he really does is send his followers to sleep, or perhaps into a possibly drug-induced trance. Thus, he is a charlatan, a chimerical figure, certainly no saviour. So in this song, Bob Dylan is kind of being funny. He's taking the mickey, if you like. He's, taking the mickey out of the way he's treated by his fans as the great oracle, the great saviour of everybody. So that's just about the end of it, really. I'm looking to see if we've got any comments. I don't think there's a lot of people out there, but somebody has written wrong. Heather has written wrong. As all she's written is wrong. I'm sure I've got something wrong. Perhaps, Heather, you could explain what that means. Let's see if there's any more comments there at all. If anybody wants to make any comments now, please do. Okay, we've got a question here from Phil Smith. What does starting with Dylan's later years reveal that might have been obscured if you had begun with his early career? Well, I guess, as I say, Dylan's later songs do tend to be this kind of patchwork of all kinds of sources. And that was kind of something he did begin with in the beginning, because he was working in certain mediums like blues and folk music, which did this very thing. They adapted different songs and made new songs out of them. They folk songs, of course, evolved over a long time. What Dylan does in his later career is he does the same kind of thing, but he takes a lot of lines from blues songs and folk songs, but he also takes a lot of stuff from other sources like 19th century poets. People have written whole books about this, about all the bits that he's stolen from somewhere or stolen from somewhere else. So I guess that's one kind of insight, I suppose. Any more questions? Anybody else got anything to ask me about what I've been saying? No? Okay, I'm still waiting for Heather to tell me what I said wrong. It says wrong. Heather Perkins, 1009. Maybe she's gone away. Who knows? Well, okay, folks. Perhaps that's the end. Oh, wait a minute. Deadline for the final book. Thank you, Phil. I haven't written the other book yet, but I've got a lot of the material ready already. Now, a lot of this material is actually available on my website, which is called From the Pen of Chris Gregory. There are 100 blogs or so on there. I also have YouTube channel, which is called Bob Dylan, A Head Full of Ideas, and a lot of it's kind of discussed there. The final book, I'm not quite sure what it's called. That's obviously going to be on the early stuff up to 1966, and I haven't really got a deadline, but I do hope to write it next year, so it should be out next year or the year afterwards. These books are also available from my website or from amazon.co.uk or amazon.com. Get them from my website there if you can. Okay. Phil says, really interesting. Thanks for the live stream. Well done. Thank you, Phil. I'm still waiting for Heather to tell me where I've gone wrong. I'm sure I have gone wrong. Anybody else want to ask any questions? No? You can ask anything you like, really. No? Okay, well, I hope you've enjoyed this. I say this is actually my first live stream. I hope I haven't said and ah too many times. And yeah, I do hope this is, piqued your interest, and you might want to go and read these books. So that's about it for now, everybody. And thank you very much for listening. So just show you those again. Those are the books. There they are. And I get that in the right place for the camera. So this really is my first time doing this, as you can tell. Okay. All right. Thanks, everybody. Night, night.